plywood, canvas. An engine that made less power than a modern lawn tractor on steroids. That was the entire aircraft. No armor, no guns, no radio, and for most of the war, no parachute either. The women who flew it called it a coffin with wings, because it was made of wood and fabric, and when a bullet found it, it burned like a barn full of dry hay. And yet, in the year 1943, over the swamps and ridgelines of the Kuban, this flying relic became the single most hated sound in the German army. Soldiers stopped sleeping. Officers begged for the noise to end. The men in the trenches gave it a name out of a children's nightmare. They called the women who flew it the Night Witches. This is the story of the Polikarpov Po Two, the obsolete trainer that should have been scrapped before the war even started, and how a regiment of young Soviet women turned it into a weapon of pure dread that robbed an entire German bridgehead of sleep, night after night, all through 1943. Let me show you how a crop duster broke the nerve of the Wehrmacht. Berlin, in the years before the war, was building monsters, sleek metal fighters, dive bombers with screaming sirens bolted under the wings, machines designed to terrify. 2,000 miles to the east, in a Soviet flying club, sat the exact opposite of all that. The Polikarpov Po Two was a biplane, which already made it a museum piece by 1941. It had two stubby wings stacked on top of each other, held apart by struts and wire. The frame was wood. The skin was treated fabric stretched over that wood. You could push your thumb through the side of it. The engine was a 5-cylinder Shvetsov M11 radial, and it produced about 110 horsepower. To put that in plain terms, a lot of modern motorcycles make more power than the engine that carried these women into combat. Flat out, the Po Two could manage about 90 miles per hour, and that was empty, in still air, going downhill, in spirit, if not in fact. Load it with fuel, a navigator, and bombs, and that number fell off a cliff. The Soviets had thousands of these things. They used them to teach teenagers how to fly. They used them to dust crops and carry mail, and ferry messages between farms. Nobody, anywhere, looked at a Po Two and saw a frontline bomber. It was the aircraft you learned on before you graduated to something that could actually fight. It was also, in a strange way, the perfect aircraft for what was coming, because the very things that made it useless in daylight made it deadly in the dark. The wood and the fabric barely showed up on the crude detection gear of the day. It flew so low and so slow that it slipped under the notice of fast machines built to hunt other fast machines. The Po Two was invisible in all the ways that would soon matter most. So how does a trainer end up terrorizing the German army? The answer starts with one woman, and a war going so badly that the Soviet Union was willing to try anything. It was the autumn of 1941, and the German army was tearing across Soviet soil at a speed nobody had believed possible. Entire armies were being surrounded and erased. Cities were falling in days. The Soviet Union was bleeding men faster than it could count them. Enter Marina Raskova. Before the war, Raskova was famous across the Soviet Union, a record-setting aviator, the kind of name schoolchildren knew. She was a Soviet celebrity with a pilot's license and the ear of Joseph Stalin himself. And she had been getting letters, thousands of them, from women. Young women across the country wanted to fight. They had brothers and fathers at the front, many already dead, and they were being told to stay home and roll bandages. They could fly. Some of them had logged real hours in flying clubs, and they were furious at being turned away. Raskova took those letters to the top, and in a country desperate enough to throw anything it had at the invaders, she got her answer. In October of 1941, Stalin authorized the creation of 3 combat air regiments crewed entirely by women. Pilots, navigators, mechanics, armorers, commanders, all of them women. There were 3 of these regiments, and it is worth knowing all 3, because they tell you how serious this was. The 586th was a fighter regiment, flying real frontline fighters in daylight. The 587th was a day bomber regiment, the unit Raskova herself would lead. And the 3rd, the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, was handed the aircraft nobody else wanted, the Po Two. Think about what that meant. The men were getting the new fighters and the real bombers. The women got the wood and canvas trainer, the thing scheduled for the scrap heap. On paper, it looked like a setup for slaughter. In practice, it would become the reason the Germans couldn't sleep. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, these women had to learn to turn a flying classroom into a killing machine. The recruits gathered at the town of Engels on the Volga, under a training group with the plain bureaucratic name of Aviation Group 122. From that one pool of volunteers, all 3 regiments were built, and the training was brutal. They compressed years of instruction into months. The recruits were mostly in their late teens and early 20s. Some were university students. Some were factory workers and teachers and farm girls. They cut their hair short, stuffed their boots with newspaper because the army only issued men's sizes, and they flew until their hands went numb. The men running the nearby training fields did not hide what they thought. To a lot of them, this was a propaganda stunt that would end in funerals. The women heard the jokes, they heard the doubts, and they answered the only way that mattered, by outflying the doubt, hour after freezing hour over the Volga, until the laughing stopped. Their commander was Yevdokia Bershanskaya. She was a careful, demanding leader, a pilot herself, and she would run this regiment from its first day to its last, every mile from the Volga to the edge of Germany. She drilled her crews on the boring things that keep flyers alive: how to read a black landscape with no lights, how to find a pinprick airstrip in the dark, how to nurse a dying engine home. Under her, the 588th started turning into something the Soviet command had not dared to hope for: a real fighting unit. The Po Two had exactly one virtue as a weapon, and the women built their entire war around it. The thing was slow. Absurdly, almost insultingly slow. And slow, it turned out, was a superpower after dark. Here is the problem the Germans faced. A modern fighter like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 was built to go fast. It had to keep its speed up or it would stall and fall out of the sky. Its slowest safe flying speed, the speed below which the wings simply quit working, was higher than the Po Two's top speed. Read that again. The German fighter could not fly slowly enough to stay behind the biplane and shoot it. If a German pilot tried to crawl along at Po Two speed to line up a shot, his own aircraft would stall and drop. The hunter could not match the prey. That single fact rewrote everything. The little wooden biplane the world had written off was, in the dark, one of the hardest things in the sky to kill. By the spring of 1943, the regiment had been blooded in the brutal fighting across southern Russia, and now they were pointed at the Kuban. This was the marshy, river-laced corner of the southern front, where the German army was dug in hard, defending a bridgehead on the Taman Peninsula. It was a meat grinder. Both sides poured men into it, and the 588th flew over it almost every single night. This is where the legend was forged. So let me take you into one of those nights, because the way these women fought is the whole reason the Germans came to dread the dark. A night mission began at a rough forward airstrip, often just a flat field with a few lanterns shaded so they couldn't be seen from above. There were no hangars. The aircraft sat out in the open in the cold. The crews waited in dugouts, in flying suits that never quite kept the chill out, listening for the order to start engines. The Po-2 carried a crew of 2, a pilot in front and a navigator behind, sitting in open cockpits with the wind in their faces. There was no canopy. There was no heater. In the cold months they flew exposed to freezing air for hours, and the women came home with faces raw and stiff, fingers so numb they had to be helped down from the wing. Some smeared grease on their skin just to keep the wind from cracking it open. The bombs hung on racks under the lower wings. The maximum the little plane could haul was about 770 pounds, and often it was less than that. Just a pair of bombs and a load of small incendiary canisters, meant to start fires in German positions. Now here is the part that made the German soldier's skin crawl. As a crew approached the target, the pilot would throttle back and cut the engine entirely. The propeller went still, and the Po-2 became a glider, sinking down out of the black sky in near total silence. The men on the ground couldn't hear an engine. They couldn't track it by sound. All they got in the last seconds was a soft whooshing hiss as the wind slid over those wood and fabric wings. To a German soldier huddled in a trench, exhausted, it sounded like a broom sweeping across the sky, like something inhuman gliding down to find him in the dark. That sound is where the name came from. The Germans called them Die Nachthexen, the night witches. The bombs would fall, the fires would catch, and only then would the pilot restart the engine and claw back up into the dark to go home, reload, and do it all again. And again, and again. As the Germans wised up and ringed their positions with searchlights and flak, the women answered with a trick that turned their own weakness into a trap. They flew in groups of 3. As they came in, one plane would deliberately swing toward the searchlights, drawing the beams and the anti-aircraft fire onto itself, dancing just out of reach. While every gun on the ground chased that one decoy, the other 2 cut their engines and glided in silent and unseen, dropped their loads on the blinded position, and slipped away. Then the crews swapped roles and did it again. The Germans were lighting up the sky to kill one biplane and never seeing the 2 that were actually bombing them. Because here is what truly broke the German army on that bridgehead. It was not the size of the bombs. A pair of small bombs from a wood and canvas biplane was never going to win a battle on its own. It was the relentlessness. A single crew might fly 8, 10, even up to 18 sorties in one night. They would land, ground crews would refuel the plane and hang fresh bombs by hand in a matter of minutes, and the women would take off again. All night, every night. And those ground crews were women too. That detail gets lost, but it matters. The 588th was the one regiment of the 3 that stayed completely female from top to bottom and never took on a single man. The armourers who muscled the bombs up onto the racks in the dark, by hand, dozens of times a night, were young women. They worked in the freezing mud with no gloves half the time, fingers torn and bleeding, racing the clock so the pilot could be back in the air before the last bomb had even finished burning. A fast turnaround on the ground was as much a part of the weapon as the glide itself. One of those pilots was Nadezhda Popova. Over the course of the war, she flew around 852 combat sorties in the Po-2. On one record night, she went up 18 separate times. Think about that. 18 times in a single darkness, she crossed into enemy fire in a wooden plane, came back, watched the ground crew reload, and climbed in again. She was shot down more than once and walked away from it, and she kept flying until the war was over. If you were a German soldier on the Taman line, all of this meant you did not sleep. You could not sleep. Every time you started to drift off, the witches came back. The hiss, the explosion, the fire. Then quiet. Then, just as your eyes closed again, another hiss. hour after hour, night after night. That is a weapon. Not the explosive, the exhaustion. The 588th wasn't just dropping bombs. They were robbing an entire army of its sleep, grinding men down until their hands shook and their judgment failed. A man who has not slept in 4 days makes mistakes. He fires at shadows. He misreads orders. He breaks. And that, more than any single crater, was what those bombs were really doing. The German command took it so seriously that they reportedly promised an Iron Cross, one of their highest medals, to any pilot who could shoot one of these biplanes down. Think about that. Their finest fighters hunting a wooden trainer flown by 20-year-old women, and the kill was considered worth one of the Empire's top honours. That promise tells you everything. The Night Witches had gotten so deep under the skin of the German army that bringing one down was treated like bringing down an ace. But do not let the legend fool you into thinking this was easy or safe. It was neither. And 1943 would prove exactly how thin the line was between terrifying the enemy and dying in front of him. For all the Po-2's strange advantages, every single thing about flying it in combat was a gamble with death. Start with the aircraft itself. Wood and fabric. One tracer round from an anti-aircraft gun, and the whole thing could go up like a torch. The women flew low, sometimes just a few hundred feet over the German lines, low enough that ordinary machine guns and flak could reach up and tear them apart. And for the early part of the war, the High Command would not even issue them parachutes. The official reasoning was that parachutes were heavy and would cut into the bomb load. So the women flew over enemy fire with no way out. If the plane caught fire, you rode it down. They had no guns to shoot back with, no armour to hide behind, no radio to call for help. They navigated by map, by compass, by the shape of rivers in the moonlight, and by memory. 2 young women in an open wooden box, gliding silently toward men who wanted them dead and would be honoured for killing them. And the Germans adapted. They knew the witches were coming, the same way you know a leak in the roof is coming the moment it starts to rain. They began stringing searchlights in careful patterns and waiting in the dark with night fighters, real fighters flown by experienced men, hunting for any way to catch the biplanes, despite the stall speed problem. One of those men was a German night fighter pilot named Joseph Kochiok, and his name belongs in this story because of what he did with that trap. On the night of July 31st, 1943, over the Taman bridgehead, that trap finally snapped shut. The crews came in toward the German positions the way they always did, expecting the usual storm of anti-aircraft fire. But that night, the flak guns stayed strangely silent. For the women in the cockpits, that silence was wrong. It was a warning they had no time to act on. Then the sky lit up. Searchlights and flares burst all around them, and out of the darkness came German night fighters that had been lying in wait. The slow, silent Po-2s, suddenly pinned in the light, were caught completely exposed. There was nowhere to hide, and no way to outrun anything. A fast fighter could not slow down to their speed, but it did not have to. It could dive through them, guns blazing, climb away, and come back around for another pass while they crawled across the open sky like targets pinned to a board. In a matter of minutes, the biplanes were falling out of the sky in flames. Joseph Kochiok alone was credited with shooting down 4 of the Po-2s that night. 4 crews. The regiment lost some of its women in one of the worst nights it would ever endure. No parachutes, no escape. They went down with their wooden aircraft, burning, watched by the same men in the trenches who had been begging for an end to the noise. It was a brutal lesson, and it was the kind of night that should have broken a unit. The enemy had finally found a way to turn the witches' own silence and slowness against them. But the regiment did not break. They changed their tactics, spaced out their approaches, climbed and dropped at different heights, learned the new danger, and they kept flying. The very next night, and the night after that, the hiss returned over the German lines. The witches did not stop. If you are getting something out of this story of the women who refused to quit, take a second to subscribe. We dig into the weapons and the people of the Eastern Front that the textbooks skip right over, and there is a lot more coming. The losses of that summer were real, and they hurt, but they did not change the outcome on the Taman line. The Germans had won a single terrible night. They had not won the war of nerves. And by the autumn of 1943, the bridgehead they were clinging to was collapsing, hammered from the ground and harassed from the air every night by the same wooden biplanes they could not stamp out. In October of 1943, in recognition of what the regiment had done over the Taman Peninsula, the 588th was given a new and honoured title. It became the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. Guards status in the Soviet military was the highest mark of distinction a unit could earn. It came with better rations, better standing, and a name the whole army knew. The wood and canvas regiment that everyone had expected to be slaughtered was now an elite formation, named for the very ground where it had bled. The young women stuffing newspaper into their boots 2 years earlier were now Guards aviators, flying the most feared night missions on that stretch of the front. And they did not stop at the Kuban. From the Taman Peninsula, the regiment followed the front line west as the German army was pushed back. They flew over Crimea and over the ruined fortress city of Sevastopol as it was torn back from German hands. They flew over Belorussia and Poland. Under Bershanskaya, the same commander who had stood with them at Engels, they flew all the way to the edge of Germany itself, harassing the retreat the entire way. The same hiss in the dark following the German soldier across 1,000 miles of ruined Europe. The men who had first heard that broom sweeping the sky over the Kuban heard it again, closer and closer to their own homes, until the war finally ran out. By the time it ended, the numbers the night witches had piled up in their little trainers were almost impossible to believe. Over the course of the war, the regiment flew more than 23,000 combat sorties. One careful count puts the figure at 23,672. 23,000 times, in an aircraft made of wood and fabric, these women crossed into enemy fire and came back. They dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs. On top of that, they rained down around 26,000 incendiary devices to set German positions ablaze. All of it from a crop duster. All of it a couple of small bombs at a time, multiplied across thousands and thousands of silent gliding runs. And the country, for once, recognized exactly what they had done. 23 women of the regiment were named Heroes of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the nation could give. Not as a courtesy. They earned every one of those, over the burning bridgeheads, one silent run at a time. And the cost. 32 women of the regiment died in service over the course of the war. Each one of them flew knowing the aircraft would burn, knowing for years there was no parachute, knowing the enemy would be honored for killing her. They flew anyway. 32 times a young woman climbed into that open wooden cockpit and did not come home. That is the trade these women made. An obsolete trainer, a coffin with wings, against the discipline and rest of an entire army. And night after night, the coffin won the war of nerves. So think back to where this started. A biplane that belonged in a flying school, an engine weaker than a motorcycle, a skin you could push your thumb through. Everything about the Polikarpov Po Two said harmless, said obsolete, said scrap it. And out of that, a regiment of women in their teens and 20s built one of the most effective psychological weapons of the entire Eastern Front. They did not beat the German army with firepower. They beat it with patience, with nerve, and with a sound. A soft hiss in the dark that meant no rest was coming tonight, or the next night, or any night until the war was over. The men in the trenches gave them a name meant as an insult, something monstrous, something out of a fairy tale. The Night Witches. But the women who flew those silent wooden planes over the Kuban in 1943 turned that insult into one of the proudest names to come out of the entire war. They took the aircraft nobody wanted and made the enemy afraid of the dark. If you want to see more of the weapons everyone underestimated until they changed the war, there is another story waiting for you on screen right now. Go watch it.